I kind of, you know, it's an aid memoir, did myself a list of 5 topics beginning with P. I was listening to the radio as I got ready this morning and heard the announcement about the Tories' promise of £8 billion. So I thought I'd add an extra P for pounds and just say a little bit about that. So my 6 are the P word, privatisation, plus pounds, plus people power, and planning and public involvement, public service, and pulled together. That's my final point. So let's just sort of pick up the privatisation angle. Obviously, Keep Our NHS Public is primarily about what it says in the name, and therefore primarily concerned with privatisation. Our aims are to have an NHS which is publicly funded, publicly provided, publicly accountable, and available to all on the basis of clinical need. So it's pretty straightforward, really. You know, the founding principles, and that's what we're campaigning for. Just, of course, in the last few years, the cuts have been such that they clearly have also been driving towards a 2-tier NHS, which would be pushing anyone who was due to have elective surgery and possibly could pay for it themselves to do so as waiting times get longer and longer, and therefore that also builds the private healthcare provider market, and so it's a kind of twin-track push towards privatisation. And it's quite clear that particularly the government is very, very keen that the word privatisation is not used. There's a kind of rubbishing of the use of the term by government spokesmen and the media, actually, if ever you raise it, because it's not a Tel-Sid type sale of the assets of the NHS, but it is just like the privatisation of the railways with long-term franchises and the right to pull in revenue from the delivery of service, just as the rail network. So it is a type of privatisation. Come back with that argument if you're ever told it's not. And as we move towards the end of this Parliament, and if we were to conclude that all the contracts that were currently out to tender were awarded in the same proportion to the private sector as those that have already been awarded in this Parliament, then £9 billion of NHS money would be being spent on private providers of clinical services if that goes true to form on what's happened so far. That's, I don't know what, you know, work it out for yourself as a proportion of 110 billion. It's about 8 or 9%, I think, isn't it, of the NHS money being spent that way. So, you know, if anyone says it's only 4% or it's only gone up 1%, that's the figure to quote. And as for the P for pounds, well, I haven't had time yet to go into it, but from what I've heard, it's promising to spend £8 billion more in the final year of the Parliament. And if you remember the budget speech from George Osborne, it was incredibly heavy cuts in the first 2 or 3 years of the Parliament, followed by a spending spree in the last year, when they supposedly would have paid off the deficit. So it's not straightforward, even if this is a promise you can believe in. It's, you know, it looks likely that the NHS and other public services will have been cut to ribbons in the intervening 2 and 3 years before we reach this nirvana of £8 billion being spent. And what's very clear, and I must say I have had the privilege over the last year or so of working with John Lister on the People's Inquiry into the NHS in London. I was the panel member, he was the driving spirit behind it. And you know, there are lots of figures in our report which shows exactly what's happening in London, although you can read it across the country as a whole. It's the same principle of a smaller and smaller proportion of gross domestic product being spent on healthcare, so that we're somewhere down around 9%, heading back towards the 6.7% it was in 1995. So I think that tells us what we should do at the election. We should at least not vote for this government, and perhaps perhaps we can be united about that, if not necessarily about what the alternatives are. So that's my first and second P, people power. I just think, you know, one of the things that strikes me is just how easy it is to get people talking about how much they care about the NHS. In KONP we've had 3 days of action over the 3 months of this year so far, and the next one is on the TTIP International Day of Action next Saturday. And lots of us have been doing stalls in marketplaces and outside supermarkets, and you know, people queue up to sign petitions. It just is hugely important to people. And they know what privatisation means. They might have been diddled by, you know, the idea that it will all be much more efficient way back in the 90s when a lot of things were sold off, but now they know it's rip-off time, and they therefore bring that knowledge to their understanding of what's happening in health. So that's a really important message. I think one of the really important things that's come over to me through that NHS, People's Inquiry into the NHS in London, where we've taken evidence from vast numbers of people who are working on campaigning in London's NHS, is that it's really, really, really important to plan in a careful and integrated and publicly supported for the future of the NHS. And there's no notion of planning in the 2012 Act. You know, the whole assumption is that the market will sort it out by adjusting as it goes along, and that's how markets work, so you don't need to plan. But it's very clear that we do, and that also, unless that planning has public involvement and public support, it's not going to happen. So many examples from Lewisham onwards about how it just wasn't possible to take forward closure and other alterations to the service because of the fact that we're just prepared to mobilise and make sure our opinion is heard. So, you know, sometimes it feels very depressing, you know, because the government's in power, it's doing what it's choosing to do. Most of the media seems to be either deluded by them or in cahoots with them, and you know, lots of think tanks getting funding from vested interests who choose to, who will benefit from privatisation. So the whole world seems ranged against us, but the people are with us, and that's the most important thing, and that's what we need to remember as we go forward. Not only forward to the 7th of May, but also to whatever happens after that. Just one final separate point on public service. I'm drawing a lot of examples from the People's Inquiry, but one of my strongest memories is Dr. Sandhu, who is an A&E consultant at Ealing Hospital, giving us evidence, and then I heard him say the same thing later at a public meeting in Hammersmith Town Hall. He said, here's a patient I admitted just the other day. It was a lady in her 70s, so I already, you know, identify. And he said she'd broken a bone in her leg, she'd fallen, and then she was in a cold flat for hours and hours and hours, and hypothermia had started to set in. He said, she's fine now, actually, we've sorted her out, but I am not going to discharge her to the same conditions as made her ill in the first place. So I am going to use my power as a senior doctor to make a key resource decision about the service that will be available for this lady. And it's quite clear that couldn't happen in a privatised hospital. And so what it really illustrates for me is the fundamental importance of the public service professionals in the NHS, who stand for values that we'll support, and who will, in their everyday action in work, try and behave in accordance with those values. And therefore they take a share of the power about what happens in the NHS. And that's the only safe way to be. So it's really, really important we don't fall for the idea that provided it's free at the point of views and it's publicly funded, it doesn't matter who delivers it. It does matter who delivers it, and whether they're governed by an organisation that returns profits to the bottom line, or whether they're governed by a public service ethos. So we do need to pull together. I know as much about this as anyone really, being co-chair of Keep Our NHS Public. We are united by a common aim, but you know, we're not aligned to any political party, and we've got lots of disagreements about politics, but we try and stay together and try and stay united around the common issue of defending our NHS. And obviously this is a massively busy time. I don't know about you, but I'm really doing actions involved in this campaign every day of the week, including Sunday. So it'll be quite nice to have a couple of weeks off after the 7th of May. And I'm sure we all look forward to that. But let's just keep our energies up and pull together and keep it going until last week.